You ever have one of those mornings where everything feels just right? Sun's out, air's crisp, and you've got a hot cup of coffee and the whole day ahead of you with nothing planned but peace and quiet. That was me. I'd just stepped outside, coffee in one hand, fishing pole in the other, heading down to my dock like I had 100 mornings before. But as I turned the corner past the trees lining my yard, I stopped cold. Right there, stretched across the little path leading to my lake access, was a brand new iron fence. Jet black, tall and smug-looking, like it was daring me to ask questions. And dead center, hanging from a thick chain, was a padlocked gate. Not some cheap hardware store latch either. This thing looked like it was built to keep out a SWAT team. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. I set my coffee down and walked up close, blinking, like maybe I was seeing things. But no, it was real. Welded, bolted, reinforced, the works. There was even a shiny metal plaque screwed onto the gate that read, "Private HOA access only. Violators will be prosecuted." My stomach dropped. I looked down at the worn path my boots had carved into the grass over the years, straight from my porch to my dock, my shoreline. And now, apparently, someone decided I didn't belong here anymore. I followed the line of the fence with my eyes. It ran left and right like a damn prison barrier, stretching all the way to my neighbor's lot on one side and curving up the hill toward the road on the other. A full-on blockade, right through the edge of my backyard, like a line drawn in steel saying, "You don't live here anymore." I didn't understand it. Nobody asked me. Nobody warned me. There hadn't been a knock on my door, no letter in the mailbox, no phone call, nothing. It was just there, like it had sprouted overnight, some bureaucratic weed choking out my peace. I stood there, dumbfounded, running through every possible explanation. Was this some kind of joke, a mistake, a prank from the neighbor kids? But the fence was no joke. Whoever built it meant business. I backed up a few steps, hands on my hips, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The worst part wasn't even the fence itself. It was the feeling that someone had quietly made a decision about my life, without including me. Like I'd woken up in someone else's rulebook. That little strip of lakefront had been mine since the day I bought the property. I paid cash. No mortgage, no HOA, no shared access. I specifically bought outside the subdivision to avoid nonsense like this. My cabin sat on a modest patch of land at the edge of the lake. No fancy landscaping, just a good view and a wooden dock where I could fish in the mornings. That dock had been my sanity after 27 years in civil engineering, designing roads, drains, bridges for people who never said thank you. And now, someone had built a fence across it, like I was the trespasser. I didn't even finish my coffee. I just stood there, staring at that plaque, trying to process what it meant that I was now locked out of my own backyard. And that's when I heard it. The slow crunch of gravel underfoot. Not hurried, not shy, confident. Like someone walking up their own driveway. I turned around and there she was. She came into view like she was walking out of a Hallmark movie, only with more arrogance. Clipboard clutched to her chest, lavender blouse so stiff it could stand up on its own, and wedge sandals that clearly weren't made for gravel. Her expression was already set, smug, tight-lipped, like she'd been rehearsing it in a mirror. She stopped a few feet from me, glanced at the fence, then looked at me like I was an inconvenience. "Hello there," she said, in that chipper tone that always sounds fake, like someone pretending to be polite while secretly hoping you fall into a hole. "We've installed a protective barrier around the lake access," she continued, like she was announcing a charity bake sale. "Strictly for HOA residents, of course. Liability concerns, you understand." I stared at her, blinked once. "Liability?" I repeated, trying not to sound as angry as I felt. "That's my dock." She gave a laugh. Short, dismissive, like I'd just told her my cat could sing opera. Well, technically, the access point sits on a parcel that's now under the maintenance of the Hemlock Shores Homeowners Association, she said, tapping the clipboard like it held the keys to the universe. You must have missed the notices. We sent several. I told her I hadn't received a single one. She didn't flinch. Oh well, these things happen. The land was under an open lease after the old bait shop owner passed away. The association secured it late last year. The bait shop. Of course. There had been a little shack there years ago. Barely more than a lean-to where a retired couple sold worms and sodas out of a cooler. I'd always assumed it was part of the public access, or at the very least grandfathered in as part of my property line. Turns out I was wrong. And apparently this woman, this clipboard-wielding queen of condescension, had swooped in like a hawk and snatched it out from under me. I asked her point blank, "Why didn't anyone knock on my door?" She smiled wider, showing teeth this time, but there was no warmth behind it. It was discussed during our October meeting, fully above board. You're welcome to submit an appeal, though as a non-member you won't have voting rights. Voting rights? I wasn't even part of their stupid HOA. I bought my land before the subdivision was even built, and now, somehow, this woman was telling me that a stretch of land I'd used for years was being rebranded as community property, and that I needed permission to access what had always been mine. I couldn't believe it. And the whole time she stood there, smiling like she'd just given me a fruitcake. The fence, the gate, the sign, it all made sense now. Karen. Her name hadn't even come up yet, but I already knew it. I didn't need to hear it to know. This was a Karen move if I'd ever seen one. And from the look in her eyes, this was just the beginning. I didn't sleep much that night. My head was spinning with everything she said, the fence, the lease, the smug way she talked like she was doing me a favor by locking me out of my own lake. I kept playing the conversation over and over in my head, wondering if I'd missed something, if there was a loophole, a clause, anything that could justify what she'd done. But no matter how I looked at it, one thing was clear. Karen had fenced me out without my knowledge, and now she was acting like I was the one in the wrong for being upset about it. I'm not someone who jumps straight to confrontation, but this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was personal. This was home, and she'd violated that. The next morning I didn't even bother putting on fishing gear. I threw on jeans, grabbed a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters from my shed, and made my way down to the gate. My plan wasn't complicated. I'd snip the lock, open the gate, and take back what was mine. I wasn't thinking long-term. I wasn't thinking legal strategy. I was thinking about the dozens of mornings I'd spent sitting on that dock, watching the mist rise off the water, and how this stranger with a clipboard had stolen that from me with a few signatures and a padlock. I got through one link, one single satisfying snap, before I heard it. That familiar crunch of gravel. And there she was again, like she'd been waiting for it. Karen came storming down the path with a security guard in tow, some guy they'd probably hired from the same strip mall they got the private access signs from, and she was already on the phone before she even reached me. "Yes, Sheriff's Department, please. I'm reporting a trespasser and property damage," she said, loud enough for me to hear every word. The guard didn't say much, just stood there, hands on his hips, like he was waiting for a paycheck, not a fight. I didn't resist. I set the bolt cutters down and crossed my arms, trying to stay calm. When the deputy arrived, he looked as confused as I felt. I walked him through everything, showed him my deed, explained how long I'd lived here, how I'd used that lake access for years. He was sympathetic, I'll give him that. But once he pulled up the parcel map, his face changed. Turns out the sliver of land between my property and the water, the one that used to house the old bait shack, was indeed leased by the HOA. Not owned, just leased. But that lease gave them the right to build the gate, control access, and treat it like common property. My stomach dropped. Legally, they weren't in the wrong. Ethically, whole different story. Karen stood off to the side, arms folded, with that victorious look in her eyes that made my blood boil. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. The damage was already done. I couldn't even get mad at the deputy. He was just doing his job. But as I watched him walk back to his cruiser, I realized something. I was playing defense. I was reacting to everything she did. And that's exactly how she wanted it. She wanted me angry, off balance, scrambling. I needed to flip the script. I spent the next few days digging. I went down to the county clerk's office, pulled every document I could find about the surrounding parcels. I highlighted boundaries, read zoning laws, old leases, obscure easement clauses, anything that might give me an edge. That's when I noticed something strange. The parcel Karen had fenced off. It was part of a larger stretch of narrow land that hugged the shoreline, but the actual spot where she'd installed the gate, the part where the posts were buried into the ground, that wasn't included in the lease. That part had a separate parcel number, a tiny, overlooked slice of land just a few feet wide, and next to that parcel number, in faded typewritten letters, were the words, "For sale." I couldn't believe it. I called the number listed, half expecting it to be disconnected or already claimed. But a cheerful voice answered. Turned out the land was owned by an elderly woman living in Alaska. She'd inherited it from her late husband and, by her own admission, forgot it even existed. When I asked if she was still looking to sell, she practically begged me to make an offer. Said it was just a tax headache she'd love to be rid of. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, and by the end of the week, the paperwork was on its way to me. I don't think I've smiled that wide in years. For a few $1,000s, less than the cost of the boat I couldn't even launch anymore, I was about to buy the land holding up Karen's precious gate. The irony was so perfect, it felt like something out of a movie. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted her to get comfortable, to believe she'd won, to keep strutting around with that clipboard and false sense of power. I let her host another HOA walkthrough, watched from my porch as she gave some speech to a group of residents like she was unveiling a community centre and not a chain-link affront to common decency. Then the deed arrived. Signed, stamped, official. I was now the legal owner of the sliver of land that held the gate. Not the fence itself. No, that was paid for and installed by the HOA. But the dirt it stood on. That was mine. The gate posts, the lock, the space it occupied, all sitting proudly on my property. I read over the deed 3 times just to make sure. Then I sat out on the porch with a cold beer, watching the sun dip behind the trees, and let the satisfaction wash over me. She wanted control so badly. She was about to get it, just not the way she thought. I waited another week before making my move. Just enough time for the gate to become a fixture in everyone's mind, for the HOA to get used to their shiny new symbol of exclusion. Then one morning, I walked down to the gate with a new padlock and a sign of my own. Nothing dramatic, just clear and simple. Private property. Access by owner permission only. I changed the lock, tossed the old one in the trash, and headed back up the hill with a smile so wide it hurt my cheeks. When the HOA crowd showed up for their big summer brunch later that afternoon, I watched from my deck as Karen marched straight to the gate, clutching her key like a golden ticket. She stuck it in the lock. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. She twisted, rattled, jiggled it furiously, her face going from confused to furious in seconds. I let her struggle a little longer before I walked down, nice and slow, holding a copy of the deed in one hand. She looked up, eyes wide with disbelief as I handed it to her. "This can't be right," she said, scanning the document like it was written in a foreign language. "You can't just buy this." I shrugged. Didn't buy your land. Bought mine, including the spot your gate's standing on. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out, just the sound of her pride caving in on itself. I leaned casually against the fence, looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Welcome to my property line." And just like that, the power shifted. It's funny how fast people flip when they think you've lost, and how much faster they panic when they realize you haven't. That gate had stood like some kind of monument to Karen's petty little kingdom, a symbol of her grip on the neighborhood and her self-appointed authority over everyone else's peace and quiet. For weeks, she strutted around like she owned the lake, organizing brunches, handing out laminated schedules for kayak rotations, acting like she was Martha Stewart with a clipboard and an inflated ego. But the moment that gate didn't open for her, when her golden key turned and still came up empty, you could almost hear the gears in her brain grinding to a halt. I let her fumble a while before I stepped in, not out of cruelty, but to let the reality of the situation really marinate. When I handed her the deed, she held it like it might bite her. Eyes scanned the parcel numbers, the highlighted lines, the legal stamps that told the story she didn't want to believe. It wasn't just a gotcha moment. It was a transfer of power. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat. I just stood there and calmly said, "You locked me out. Now I own the lock." And with that, I walked away. Left her there in her pastel blouse, surrounded by folding chairs and fruit platters, clutching a useless key and a clipboard that suddenly felt very, very light. Word spread fast. By the end of the day, half the neighborhood had heard what happened. The other half were on their way over to see it for themselves. I didn't have to post anything, send out an email, or make a scene. The story told itself. Karen had fenced me out of my own lake access, and I'd bought the ground out from under her fence. People whispered about it at dog walks and HOA meetings. Some were impressed, some were skeptical. A few were clearly annoyed that the drama might cut into their scone time. But the tide had turned. I wasn't the stubborn outsider anymore. I was the guy who'd outplayed the Queen on her own board. Karen, of course, didn't take it well. The next few days were a flurry of frantic activity. First came a letter, folded, typed, delivered to my door by one of the HOA teenagers who looked like he wanted to disappear into the grass. The letter accused me of undermining community morale and jeopardizing HOA unity through unsanctioned land acquisitions. It sounded like something written by a middle manager with delusions of grandeur. I filed it in the recycling bin. Then came another letter, this time from a lawyer claiming the HOA had implied cooperative use rights to the land based on historical neighborhood access. I replied with a copy of my deed and a sticky note that said, "Imply this." But the real shift came when Stephanie showed up. Now Stephanie was different. Younger, sharper, the kind of person who didn't buy into Karen's nonsense, but also didn't want to start a civil war over a fishing dock. She came by with a clipboard of her own, though hers didn't look like a weapon. She asked if we could walk the property line. I said sure. We walked along the edge of the fence, and I pointed out the markers, the boundaries, the whole absurd setup. Stephanie shook her head, clearly annoyed. "Karen never ran this by the full board," she said. "She just told everyone the land was uncontested HOA property. Nobody double-checked it." I could see the wheels turning. The board wasn't just misled, they'd been played. Karen had spent thousands in HOA funds on a fence built across land the HOA didn't even control. That wasn't just embarrassing. That was a problem. Stephanie thanked me for the walkthrough, said she'd be bringing it up at the next meeting. I told her if they needed a consultant, my hourly rate was 1 fishing tip and a 6-pack. Then things escalated in a way I didn't see coming. A few days later, while flipping through some old county zoning maps with a buddy of mine, Brian, a guy I used to work with who now dealt with land use and planning, we came across something interesting. Because the strip of land I'd bought was narrow, irregularly shaped, and not being used for anything commercially, it actually qualified for reclassification under a state preservation clause. It wasn't just private now. It could be protected. Brian helped me draft the paperwork. Within 2 weeks, that strip of lakeside became a legally designated ecological rest corridor. Translation? No development, no events, no gatherings, not without a stack of permits and environmental reviews taller than Karen's ego. I installed a new sign, same spot, same tone. Just one extra line, county protected area, authorized access only. And just like that, Karen's brunch zone became a no-go zone. The fallout was immediate. Emergency board meetings, angry emails, an HOA group chat meltdown that one of the younger residents later summarized as pure chaos. Karen tried to push back. She called the zoning office, argued, demanded a review. But the official told her the same thing I already knew. The application was airtight, the land use compliant, and her event calendar was now as empty as her gate's purpose. For me, life finally started to settle into something resembling normal. I went back to fishing, started rebuilding the dock a little at a time, added a new bench for visitors who asked politely. The lake returned to its quiet rhythm. But for Karen, it was just the beginning of the unraveling. Every time she passed the gate now, she had to look at that sign, had to accept that she wasn't in control, that the fence she built for exclusion had become a monument to her failure. And deep down, I think that bothered her more than anything. Because people like her, they can't handle losing. Not just the battle, but the spotlight. And I had a feeling her next move was already in the works. Karen didn't go quietly, of course. People like her never do. After the gate fiasco, after the deed, after the environmental protection designation that effectively turned her little victory into a permanent reminder of defeat, I thought maybe she'd retreat, lick her wounds, and move on. But no. Instead, she doubled down. The HOA board tried to distance themselves from her. Stephanie in particular seemed more and more fed up by the day. But Karen clung to her fantasy of power like it was a life raft. And sure enough, just as I was settling back into some form of peace, she made her next move. It started subtly, a trickle of rumors about a vote. Not your average neighborhood issue either. This was a proposed vote to reclaim the disputed parcel as community greenway space. Sounded harmless, right? A little trail here, some benches there, maybe a birdhouse or two. Except the fine print said otherwise. Karen wanted to vote her way back into ownership of my land. And the kicker? She was doing it under the guise of neighborhood beautification. She tried to paint it as a selfless gesture, something for the children, for nature, for the good of the lake. Meanwhile, she was calling it a reclamation strategy in private emails to board members, the same ones she had spent years intimidating and manipulating into silence. That's when I realized reacting wasn't enough anymore. I had to go on offense. I called Brian again. We pulled more records, reviewed more zoning documents, combed through old HOA filings, anything that could be used to solidify my position and shut this scheme down before it gained traction. And what we found only added fuel to the fire. Turns out, because of how narrow the parcel was, less than 6 feet in some sections, and because it wasn't designated for any structural purpose, the state had a provision that allowed owners to permanently restrict public use through a simple eco-preservation classification. I'd already done this once, but now I had the documentation to prove that even a board vote couldn't override it. So I filed another amendment. This time the parcel wasn't just protected, it was locked down tighter than Fort Knox. No structures, no gatherings, no modifications without an environmental permit. Karen could vote all she wanted. Legally, it wouldn't change a thing. I also sent copies of the new designation to the HOA board, the county zoning office, and, just to be thorough, Karen's lawyer. No response from her legal team, not even a counter letter. That silence said everything. But Karen wasn't out of cards yet. No, her next move was as dramatic as it was pathetic, an online crusade. Suddenly she was everywhere, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. She called her campaign Save Our Shoreline. She filmed rants in her backyard, which, by the way, was now 3 states away, with green screen backdrops of the lake she no longer lived near. She wore floral scarves and spoke like she was leading a movement. Her posts were a mix of conspiracy theory and PTA drama, claiming I had seized sacred community land, that I was gatekeeping nature, and hilariously, that I was a tyrant with a tool belt. In one video, she edited in crying children and confused ducks, real ducks, just quacking over stock footage of lakes. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so bizarre. And here's the thing, for a hot minute, people paid attention. A few outrage bloggers picked up her posts. Hashtags started floating around. Free the dock, lake lockdown. One guy even emailed me asking if I'd rent the land back to the community. Another wanted to shoot a documentary. He was from Oregon, said, "Injustice is universal." I asked if he'd ever been to my lake. He hadn't. At first I was furious. I didn't ask for any of this attention. I wasn't trying to be some local legend or accidental folk hero. I just wanted to sit by the water, fish, and not get bossed around by someone wielding a clipboard like a scepter. But then, something incredible happened. The internet turned on her. Hard. Reddit got a hold of her videos. They tore them apart, meme by meme. Someone made a side-by-side comparison of her HOA rants and Yelp reviews she'd left for nail salons, delis, a carpet cleaner, each one more unhinged than the last. A thread titled, "Karen tried to fence a lake and got wrecked by a retired engineer," hit the front page. Another meme showed me in my fishing chair with the caption, "You shall not base." That one made me laugh out loud. Someone even found an old HOA newsletter from her previous neighborhood, where she'd been ousted for trying to ban inflatable holiday decorations. The pressure worked. Her posts slowed down, then stopped, and then came the final nail. The county issued her a fine, nearly $10,000. Apparently, in her original permit application for the gate, she'd signed off claiming the land was under HOA ownership. It wasn't. That was fraud. Not criminal, but enough to hit her with zoning violations and legal fees. After that, her online campaign evaporated. No more green screen rants, no more hashtags. Her final post was a vague, overly dramatic caption. "Moving on to better waters." I assumed that meant Florida, or a gated condo with fewer people willing to fight back. Things finally quieted down. The HOA board, with Stephanie now acting as interim president, began rewriting their policies. They started including more transparency, more community input, and, this part made me chuckle, less unilateral gate installation. I was invited to their next meeting as a consultant. I declined the formal title, but agreed to bring donuts and sarcastic commentary. It seemed like a fair trade. One morning, I walked down to the gate and took off the heavy-duty padlock, left the gate wide open. In its place, I hung a small laminated sign that read, "Access granted by courtesy. Respect earns welcome. Entitlement earns nothing." I wasn't trying to keep people out anymore. I just wanted people to understand that what matters isn't fences or rules. It's how we treat each other. And to my surprise, people actually got it. Teenagers came by to fish and cleaned up after themselves. An older couple brought a bench and asked if they could sit by the water. I printed out a stack of permission slips. If someone asked nicely, they got one. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about setting a tone. Then one day, a teenage boy knocked on my door, said his name was Mason. His family had just moved in, I heard you've got the best fishing spot on the lake, he said nervously. My friends dared me to sneak in, but my grandpa always said the right way's slower but doesn't burn bridges. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I reached under my porch swing, pulled out a permission slip, and handed it to him. Welcome to the lake, Mason. Just clean up your bait wrappers and don't scare the fish. The grin on his face could have lit up the whole shoreline. A few weeks later, the HOA hosted a small lakeside gathering. Nothing fancy, just neighbors talking, sharing food, appreciating the view we all nearly lost to one person's need for control. Stephanie gave a little speech, thanked everyone who had stepped up when things got ridiculous. To my horror, she also included a segment called Hemlock Legends. I thought it was a joke, until she said my name. Kids held up hand-painted signs that said, "Thanks, gate guy, and we love the dock." One kid drew me in a fishing hat with laser eyes shooting from the gate. No idea where that came from, but it was oddly flattering. She handed me a plaque. Real wood, nicely carved. It read, "In recognition of community integrity and unmatched patience." I had to laugh. I was expecting something more like most likely to cause petty chaos, but hey, I'll take it. Later that night, long after the party had cleared out, I was sitting on my dock with a thermos in one hand and my fishing pole in the other, when a silver sedan pulled up near the road. A woman stepped out, sunglasses, scarf, shoes way too white for a dirt path. She walked down slowly, quietly. No clipboard, no entourage, just her. Karen stood by the gate and looked at it for a long time, like she was visiting the ghost of a bad decision. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Opened it, looked inside, closed it again, didn't take anything out. She didn't say a word until she turned to leave. Then she looked at me and said, "Not loud, just clear enough." "Still got the key?" I raised my thermos. "Still don't need to use it." She gave the faintest nod, turned, and walked away. No drama, no rant, just a quiet exit. And somehow that was more powerful than anything else she'd done. That gate, the one she installed to keep me out, now stood open. Not because I had to leave it that way, but because I could. And that felt like real peace.